Well, thanks everybody for being here. I'm really happy to welcome Shelley Jansky to Kiwana Wild Ones regular meeting in advance Zoominar. And she's going to speak on embracing native plants, trials and tribulations. Shelley is a professor emerita who, having just left the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and where she was in the plant and agro ecosystem sciences department. And she focused her considerable energies on breeding potatoes that would last longer, which is always a good thing, especially if you're one of us who's ever stuck her finger through a potato. And, well into her career, she discovered native plants. And now I'm very grateful that she's going to be talking about her adventures with us tonight. So Shelley, take it away.
Great, thank you. Good evening. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today to tell my story. I'm going to talk about how and why I've embraced native plants and also touch on some of the trials and tribulations that I've encountered along the way. First, though, I'd like to give a shout out to my good friend Gisela, who's a member of your chapter. As you can see, we go way back. Gisela visited me last year, and we had a wonderful discussion about native plants. Gisela then connected me with Marcia, who invited me to give this presentation. So thank you, Gisela and Marcia and the Kiwana Wild Ones chapter for the invitation to speak here today. I've always loved to be outdoors, from hanging out on the lawn with my dad, to carving a garden out of the cornfield in my backyard under the supervision of our family dog, to hugging hemlocks in the Northwoods. My happy place has always been in the natural world. Because of my love for the outdoors, and especially for plants, I chose a career that allowed me to work with plants every day. As a plant geneticist, I spent my summer days taking notes in our research plots. And I developed a passion for native plants, in this case, wild relatives of potato. This is one that I found growing in the high Andes of Peru. My job focused on growing these plants in Wisconsin to identify traits that allowed them to thrive under adversity and then breed those traits into cultivated potatoes. It was a good fit for me and certainly a very satisfying, rewarding career. But I retired 4 years ago in 2020 and stepped away from the plant genetics research that had occupied my mind for nearly 40 years. Of course, my love for science and curiosity about biology is in my blood. After my retirement, my reading interests shifted from plant genetics to the state of our natural world. Of course, I'd heard about news headlines that talked about the biodiversity crisis, but I just assumed that they were exaggerated to get our attention. When I started reading the big data studies in respected scientific journals, I was astonished. This is one example. It says that billions of North American birds have vanished. This paper documents the loss of 1/3 of the birds in North America in my lifetime. This is an incredible number for me. In another example, this UN report indicates that 1 million plant and animal species are headed toward extinction, many of them in the next few decades. And this paper, published in the journal Science with a fancy name, places us in the 6th mass extinction event in the history of our planet. So these data are not just attention grabbers for the nightly news. The biodiversity crisis is real, and we need to do something about it. So what's causing this crisis? Many things are, of course, but there does seem to be a common theme, and it's habitat loss. So if we go back to the bird paper, the section that I highlighted says, the results from the most comprehensive inventory ever done of North American birds point to ecosystems in disarray because of habitat loss. The next extinction paper says that the rate of species extinctions is already tens to hundreds of times higher than the average across the past 10 million years. Without drastic action to conserve habitats, the extinction rate will only increase. And finally, the defaunation paper. Defaunation simply means extinction of animal species. Defaunation is both a pervasive component of the planet's sixth mass extinction and also a major driver of global ecological change. So it's a vicious circle. Habitat loss is leading to extinctions, which causes further degradation in the ecosystems in which wildlife lives. I have to say, it's feeling pretty helpless at this point. How am I supposed to respond to this information? What can I do? And this is when I discovered Doug Tallamy. He probably doesn't need any introduction to many of you, but if you haven't read his books, they are certainly required reading for anyone interested in native plants. Dr. Tallamy is an entomologist at the University of Delaware, and he's become an incredible advocate for native plants, which are critical for supporting native insect populations, which of course is his interest. In his first book, Nature's Best Hope, Dr. Tallamy argues that the best hope for Mother Nature is us. And in his second book, he tells us that we provide that hope by bringing nature home. Very simply, if each of us adds native diversity to our yards, collectively, we can help to reverse the loss of biodiversity on our planet. We all know the monarch story. The numbers, again, though, are almost impossible to comprehend. When I was a child, monarchs were a colorful, common summer event. They provided a splash of color every summer. But at the turn of this century, the monarch population crashed. It dropped by over 80% in 2 decades. An 84% drop in the population in only 20 years. That's an incredible number to me. Of course, there's many reasons for the monarch struggles, but a major one is habitat loss. And while a butterfly can nectar on many types of flowers, a caterpillar's food is typically very specialized. Plants don't want caterpillars to eat them, so they produce toxins to protect themselves. And each type of caterpillar can break down those defenses, but only typically in a single family or perhaps a couple families of plants. This monarch caterpillar cannot feed on hosta or butterfly bush or even coneflower. It can only feed on plants in the milkweed family. No milkweed, no caterpillars, no butterflies. As a biologist, that should have been obvious to me. However, I just didn't get that connection until I read Dr. Tallamy's books. So we need caterpillars to feeding on our plants if we want butterflies and moths in our world. But caterpillars are also important as bird food and food for other animals in our world. This is a little chickadee. It weighs 1/3 of an ounce. It's a tiny little bird. When spring arrives, if all goes well, this little bird will find a mate. It'll build a nest, it'll lay eggs, and the pair will raise their babies. What do they feed their babies? Well, caterpillars, of course. Caterpillars are easy to catch. They're large, they're nutritious, they're soft, they're perfect baby food. But what's astonishing to me, and this is Dr. Tallamy's work, is that a pair of chickadees needs to find 400 caterpillars every day for 17 days in order to raise its clutch of young. 400 caterpillars every single day for more than 2 weeks. And this is just one little bird family. So my neighborhood needs to produce thousands of caterpillars every day in the spring and the summer in order to feed these bird families. So we need to grow plants that will grow caterpillars. So moving on from butterflies to bees, of course, bees are important pollinators. This is a bumblebee harvesting nutritious pollen from a figwort plant, which is an amazing plant if you've ever grown it. It's a very cool plant for pollinators. And it's providing a service. The bumblebee is providing a service to the plant, acting as a pollinator, and it's getting a reward in return. I've just learned, though, that the bees in my yard are providing an additional service. In addition to being pollinators, they are doing something else. I took this picture of a Cape May warbler in our plum tree in our yard a few weeks ago. We had 4 species of warblers flitting around our flowering trees that day, and I was wondering what they were up to. I took some pictures, and this one answers that question. If you look closely, you can see that this warbler is eating a bee. So the bird is eating a bee. The bee has been pollinating, but it's also serving as bird food. So the food web in our yards is complex. And of course, as the summer progresses, our native wildflowers produce seeds. Those seeds will serve as bird food. This little goldfinch has found a feast on a native thistle in our yard. And that seed supply lasts through the winter. I saw juncos and chickadees and nuthatches and cardinals and other birds hopping around the tangle of dead plants all winter, finding little nuggets of nourishment every day. So there is a complex food web in my yard, and a diversity of native plants contributes to the food web in a diversity of ways. So with that introduction, I've explained why I've embraced native plants. Now I'd like to move into how I've done so. 10 years ago, my husband and I were living in Madison, but we were starting to think about retirement. We bought this property in central Wisconsin with the plan to build our house, a retirement house on it, and spend our retirement years here. The land is about 1.5 acres. And you can see that there are oaks along the front here where they can find some light. If you look toward the back, the bright area is actually a small lake. And in the center, there's an abandoned red pine plantation. So 4 years ago, in 2020, I retired, and we took down some of the red pines to build our house. At that time, I hadn't really yet learned about native plants and really embraced the concept of our biodiversity crisis. So I was planning to make a beautiful front yard using common nursery plants. This was right when COVID hit us, so everything was done online. I ordered hybrid roses and butterfly bush and mock orange and Shasta daisies and many other kinds of plants. Little did I realize at that time that I would be ripping many of those plants out in a couple of years. But what I'd like to focus on now instead of my front yard is the backyard, or the part of the yard that faces the lake. And this is a part of the property that was really basically an open palette for me because it had been graded during the construction process and needed to be seeded. So here's the view that we saw from our deck after we built our house. We're looking out toward the lake. You can see at the bottom of the image a catch basin. The builder had to create that in order to keep rainwater from traveling off the roof and straight down into the lake. There's a steep hill on the other side of that catch basin. So we needed to get something growing on this bare ground, and we needed to do it quickly. It needed to be able to absorb the water caught in this catch basin at the top of the hill. And this was very early in my native plant journey. I ordered a wildflower mix, which I thought was a good thing. I think many of you know where I'm going from here. Yes, the mix contained wildflowers, but they were wildflowers from Siberia, China, California, and all kinds of other places. But I didn't know that that was a problem at the time. I worked really hard to get this hillside seeded and was thrilled that the next year there's all kinds of greenery on that hill. And this is what I saw. And for those of you who might recognize it, there is a problem here. Actually, there's several problems. One of them is that there's not much diversity. It's all the same thing. And all I see here is bachelor buttons in an invasive species. Yikes. So this seed mix was really heavy in pioneer species, which grow quickly, produce a lot of seeds. And again, that thrilled me at first because I thought, wow, this is exactly what I want. This is a fantastic seed mix. Well, these pioneer species put all their energy into making seeds and not much into making roots. So it's not really very helpful for water control. So I have been very pleased with my success until I realized what I had done. So this is 2021, a year after my retirement. And this is 2022. So the next year, so now I'm on the side of the hill. The next year, the bachelor buttons had been replaced by white yarrow, which is both introduced and native, and it smothered everything else. So here I am on the hill in the third summer. I had to work on a ladder because the hill is so steep. You can see, well, you can't see, but the catch basin is just above me. You can see our house back there. And then to the right is the lake. And you can see the yarrow at the far end of the hill. It was not really letting anything else grow. So I went across the hill, one strip at a time. I'm not sure if this was the right thing to do, but that's what I did. One strip at a time, and yanked out anything that wasn't native. Oops, it looks like I missed a little red poppy off there to the left. But anyway, I was left with this mostly bare hill that had a smattering of native plants on it. Fortunately, at this time, I was maturing in my native plant knowledge and had started winter sowing earlier in the year, and I'll get to that in a bit. But after clearing out the icky plants, I planted the whole hillside in plugs that I had grown. And this is what it looked like the next year. I've tried many methods for growing native plants in my yard, and have found that winter sowing combined with growing plugs is really the most successful and cost-effective strategy for me anyway. So that's what I'd like to move on to is my planting strategy. So for those of you who are not familiar with winter sowing, here's what it's all about. It's a very simple and reliable way to get native plant seeds to germinate. You cut a milk jug open, leaving a hinge at the handle. Fill it with your favorite potting mix. And then sow seeds in the winter, hence the name winter sowing. I usually sow my seeds in January. That's one thing I love about winter sowing is in the dead of winter, I get to get my hands dirty and play with seeds. Sometimes a little more so than I probably should. I get a little over enthusiastic at that time of the year and wonder why I did when June comes around. But anyway, I sow the seeds, cover them with a little bit of potting mix if they're bigger seeds like these ones, and then put the milk jugs outside on the ground for the winter. So unlike the vegetable and flower seeds you buy at your local garden center, which lack seed dormancy because plant breeders have bred that out of them, native plants are dormant in the fall. They need to experience a winter in order to germinate. And they measure that winter in terms of the time that they've been exposed to temperatures just above freezing in moist soil. So winter sowing provides this environment to overcome seed dormancy. And in the spring then, the seeds will germinate. On the left is the rose mallow milk jug in January when I was just winter sowing. And this is a picture I took just a few days ago. So they're popping up, and unlike seedlings grown indoors, which is something I've tried as well, these little seedlings are already acclimated to the outdoor environment and they're ready to plant. Some people like to plant these seedlings then directly into the ground. I prefer to take an extra step and put my seedlings into plug trays. I let them grow for a few weeks, and then I have sturdy plugs to put into the ground. This is what my operation looks like in full swing. You can see differences in seedling size from flat to flat due to differences in germination and seedling growth rates. We have lots of critters, red squirrels, gray squirrels, deer, raccoons, toads, other little animals that are very curious about this activity. So we've built cages using hardware cloth and boards, actually from the red pines we took down to build the house. And these little cages work very effectively to keep the plants safe until they're established enough that they can be put into the ground. So on planting day, I pop the seedlings out of the plug trays, put them in a carrying bin. And you can see these are cardinal flower plugs. This really shows, what I'd been reading about with native plants. They put a lot of their energy into making roots, and the top parts are pretty small, but you can see why they can take off very quickly once they go into the ground with these root systems. So I carry them off, find a good home for each plug, dig a hole, press the seedling into the ground, water it if rain isn't in the forecast, and then move on to the next one. Now, I think of myself as a fairly well-organized and rational person, but this whole native plant business does something to me. I always chuckle when I see this cartoon on Facebook. This is me. How I think I look on the left, discussing my seed purchases and garden plans, versus on the right, how I actually look. My husband will attest to my behavioral change when I step out into the yard. So this is a typical planting day. This is one of dozens every summer. It looks chaotic, but I have a plan in my head and I'm eager to implement it. With each plant that goes into the ground, I think of all the life that will benefit from it, and that energizes me. And when I see this, I can't wait to do more. These were almost all plants installed through plugs. Many of them will flower the first year that I plant them. So there are quite a few reasons that I use plugs. One is that I'm not a patient person, and these plugs do produce large plants quickly. Another is that the plugs allow me to implement some basic landscape design techniques, and that's not something you get when you toss a seed mix on the ground. So I can make repeating patterns, I can use massing, I can make mass plantings of something, and this is good not only for eye appeal, but it helps the pollinators, because once they find the right plants, they have lots of them that they can work from. So that reduces their energy needs to find what's important for them. And I can arrange the plants according to their competitiveness. When I put the Joe Pye in the foreground here next to the Monarda right behind it, they push back against each other, but neither overwhelms the other. I don't have the situation that I had with that yarrow that first year. So the plug method has worked very well for me. So what I'd like to do now is move on to the trials and tribulations a bit, what I've learned. And I'll have to admit that my learning curve is still very steep, but that's part of what makes this interesting and fun. The first year that I winter sowed, the milk jugs became embedded in a big mass of ice in the spring, and they just didn't drain very well. So I thought, okay, the next year I'll be smart. I'll put them up on shelves. So I put this black shelving down. I put the milk jugs on top of the shelving and figured that they wouldn't be stuck in ice in the spring. But at our Central Wisconsin Wild Ones meeting in March, I was talking about the milk jug method, and our former president said to me, well, the reason that winter sowing works is that the milk jugs are on the ground. They need to be snuggled to the earth under a blanket of snow, because in that environment, the temperature inside the milk jugs is at or just above freezing. So it could be below zero outside, but underneath the snow blanket on the ground, these milk jugs are just above freezing. And that's really the temperature that's needed for stratification, for overcoming this dormancy process. So the next day I went and took all these milk jugs off their shelves, put them down on the ground, shoveled snow over them, and hoped that I could salvage them. But this was March, and some of them didn't get their required number of chilling days. And so some of them didn't germinate last year, and that was not the best year for me for winter sowing. So keep the milk jugs on the ground, keep them covered with snow. That shouldn't be a problem for you guys up in the UP. So that blanket of snow on the ground is very critical. Another thing that I've learned is to trust that even if seeds are tiny, 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 they will germinate. Lobelias and penstemons especially, the seeds look like dust. And I just don't feel like I'm sowing anything. So I toss a few more onto the surface, and this is what I get. These seedlings are so crowded that they're stunted, and they just are not going to grow any better than this. And this is actually really overwhelming to open this up and see all the seedlings and wonder what in the world I'm going to do with all of them. So this last year, I sowed what felt like almost nothing on the surface of the potting mix for the lobelia. And this is what I got. This is a picture I took just a couple of days ago. You can see they're quite a bit slower than the rose mallow, so things do emerge at different times. They're still a little bit crowded, but they're certainly much better than the previous year. And this is certainly a workable density for me to have. So when I first ordered plug trays, I bought the deeper ones because I read that native plants put a lot of effort into growing roots, and I thought that we needed to have this big, deep root system. I've actually moved to the shorter plug trays, like the one on the right, for most of my seedlings now. First of all, they use half as much potting mix. The plugs are ready to plant earlier, so I have a faster turnover of my plug trays, which is important when I have a lot of seedlings to sow. But most importantly, if I'm planting into tree roots or rocks, and I have a lot of them, it's just much harder to dig a deep hole for these large plugs. And of course, the deeper the hole I dig, the more I disturb the soil. So most of the time, these smaller plugs work very well for me. As a lifetime gardener, I've really had to abandon some very deeply entrenched ideas I have about what I see in my yard. In the past, if I saw that something had been nibbling on a leaf, I immediately thought I needed to do something about it. I need to kill whoever is eating this plant in order to save it. No, now I see that this is a sign that I'm doing something right. If someone is eating this native plant, then my work is contributing to the ecosystem. That's a good thing. This violet will be just fine without my help. Now I get excited in a good way when I see insects on my plants. These aphids were on a rose milkweed in my yard last year. My inclination was to squash the aphids or, heaven forbid, spray them with insecticide, but I left them alone. And 2 days later, I went back to that same plant and they were gone. I imagine that a little house wren came upon this bounty and feasted on these juicy little sugar-filled sacks of deliciousness. And I'm starting to think about my yard in a whole new way, giving over control to Mother Nature. She knows how to create a balance. Another huge change in my mindset has been my strategy toward weeding. I try to do as little of it as possible, but I still pull weeds. And in the past, I pulled everything that I didn't recognize. If it didn't fit into my neat garden plan, I didn't want it. Now I only pull what I do recognize as an agricultural weed or an invasive plant. This pasque flower showed up unannounced in my front yard. If I had been in the habit of pulling anything out of place, I would have destroyed this little beauty. So I'm going to finish with some more images from my yard and hopefully have some time for for questions if you have them. I continue to be amazed by the diversity of life that has emerged from a piece of land that was mostly pine trees and poison ivy just a few years ago. And yes, I see the irony in chopping down trees and building a home while advocating for maintaining wild land. I was, I guess in my defense, blissfully ignorant when we did that. Now I see land in a new light, and I hope that I'm giving back more than I took. Certainly we have many more species of native plants on our acre and a half than we had 4 years ago. We're seeing more birds move in every year. It's not unusual for me to see 30, 35 species of birds in our yard on a spring day. And we see many more butterflies and a diversity of bees, especially the small native ones that just weren't around when we first bought the land. And of course, dragonflies and all kinds of insect diversity. So I'm no longer looking at my yard as a piece of artwork that I arrange and control. I'm now an active member of this community. I'm a part of nature, not apart from it. And I don't know if you are familiar with the book, We Are the Ark by Mary Reynolds, but I'm going to paraphrase her first and then quote her. I am now a guardian and not a gardener. Since I'm not as eloquent as Ms. Reynolds, I'm going to quote her over the next several slides, pictures again taken in my yard. She says that those who have embraced native plants are, quote, creating a wave of change and empowerment that will quickly build into a roaring tsunami of life. There is so much joy, satisfaction, and belonging available in restoring land to its truth, to its wild ways. Such wonder and beauty are on offer when we give our land back to nature, when we set it free. Once your eyes are open, there's no going back to being a gardener. You'll never look at your land the same way again. Once its true nature has been revealed, you'll fall in love with it, because the earth's nature is truly magical and beautiful, as is ours. We are here to be of service to the earth and all her creatures. End of quote. So this has been a phenomenal journey with many bumps in the road, of course, but the rewards have been much more deeply satisfying than I ever imagined. I can't wait to get outside every day. It's the first thing I do when I get up in the morning. I sometimes feel actually overwhelmed by the beauty and the complexity of the world just outside my door. And that's a good thing. I can't imagine a more perfect way to spend my time. Thank you.
Shelley, that was fantastic.
Thank you.
This is when, as nice as Zoom is, I wish that we were in person so I could give you a standing ovation.
Thank you. Well, this is my new passion, and again, I really appreciate the chance to share it with you and your group. I know I'm preaching to the choir, but it really has been amazing for me to realize how much I didn't know and how much there is to learn. It's been quite a process for me.
One of the things that really struck me, when looking at the photos of your garden, is that it's pretty spectacular. And you only got started on this a few years ago. Do you think that your background in horticulture gave you something of a leg up on propagating all these plants?
Yeah, I think my background is a blessing and a curse. The blessing part is that I do have a lot of experience with growing plants. Mostly we grew them in a greenhouse, but that translated pretty well to what we do here with winter sowing in our little mini greenhouses. I follow a lot of Facebook pages on winter sowing and gardening, and some things that I take for granted, like making sure that the plants never dry out in their little pots, and making sure that the root systems are established, and not overwatering and underwatering. Those are all things that are pretty deeply ingrained in my background. The curse part is that I do have certain expectations. I have certain ways of doing things. I think one example is, as soon as I see a plant starting to wilt, I want to go water it. And that's just, we were keeping our research plants alive. We never let them wilt. And I think that has led to some problems, because if I keep these things well watered, that also encourages agricultural weeds to get established. So again, there's positive and negative aspects of my background. Overall, though, I certainly think that spending 40 years professionally playing with plants and 60 years really playing with plants has worked to my advantage. The other advantage is that I'm retired, and I do this all day, every day. And I have to be careful, because I don't want anyone watching to get discouraged and think, well, I can't do this. I don't have the time to do this. And that's absolutely true for many people. But even making, planting an aster in a flower pot, or making a little 2x4 foot garden out in your front yard can make a difference. And all of that effort, as Dr. Talamy says, any little effort we can do can collectively have an impact.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you ever plant a plant and then regret it?
I haven't yet. It's too
Except for
too
maybe
early
that weird wildflower mix.
Well, yeah, except for the wildflower mix. I'm struggling with the crazy forget-me-nots now. They're just everywhere. The advantage, I think, of that is that I figure they can't go anywhere but downhill. So I just keep weeding them from the bottom of the hill, and hopefully they'll go away eventually. So yeah, certainly there are things in that that wildflower mix that I regretted. Most of them, actually. I haven't planted common milkweed or Canada goldenrod, because I hear that those can get aggressive. Some of them have come in on their own, and I just make sure that I tame them. I have planted some cup plants that are just starting to get established, and we'll see. I've seen people say that they regret those because they get pretty big, but I just want to see what they look like. The Joe Pye in the front here, I do see it marching across the hillside. We'll see whether that's a problem. I mean, that's part of the learning process too, just to see how all of these players work together or not to create their own little landscape.
Well, it's fabulous. I haven't seen any questions in the chat. If people do have any, please feel free to ask, or if you're more comfortable, just unmute yourself and shout. I would just like to say that I never regretted cup plants.
Oh yeah, good.
You just have
good.
to keep, they're not hard to recognize. And
yeah,
if you just keep them under control, and if you're in an area where there's a lot of plants, it's probably harder for them to get a purchase in a place like your yard than in a plowed field.
Right. They have to push back against somebody.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Shelley, I have a question. This is Gisela.
Hi, Gisela. Yeah.
Hi. You don't have any pictures of grasses. Did you put in native grasses in your?
I'm glad you asked that. I could have planted that question, and I'm glad you asked, because I have not been. I haven't embraced grasses as much as I should, and this year for me is the year of the grasses. So I am growing, brome grass and side oats, grama, and a bunch of sedges, and plugging them in wherever I can. I really wish I would have put those in from the start. I didn't appreciate the value of those, not only for just the appearance, the diversity, the contrast of textures, but I've been reading that these, the grasses and sedges really help to support the forbs and keep them from flopping over. So I am plopping them in. That's a bit of a problem with my strategy now, though, because I have these established plants, and even if I put plugs in, it's really hard for them to get going quickly enough to compete against what's already in place. To try to account for that, and knowing that sedges grow slowly, I actually germinated the seeds inside in my basement in March. And I planted a bunch of them out in early May, thinking they'd get a head start before everything else does. But what I didn't realize, I think, is that the soil is still cold in May, and they just sat there. They didn't grow very much for the first couple of weeks. They're starting to take off a little bit now, but I don't think that I got the head start that I was expecting by starting them inside and getting them outdoors right away. So we'll see how that works. But yeah, thanks for the question, Gisela. That is really important to get those perennial non-forbs in the ground along with the forbs.
We have a couple more questions from the chat. Can you suggest native plants for dry shade under trees? Have you done any of that?
Dry shade under trees. So we do have a little piece of our pine plantation that we've retained. And one thing that I grow is, let me think of the name right now. Columbine has worked reasonably well in there. And cutleaf coneflower has done pretty well. The problem is, so I've been planting things in that dry area that, I always go to Prairie Moon Nursery and just look up, the conditions. I would just look up dry and shady. And these are the couple things that I have found. The problem is that when I put the plugs in, I water them and I keep them watered. So they were watered in last year. They grew very beautifully. They've come in really nicely this spring. We've had a beautiful wet spring. We'll see how they do once the soil dries out, but it's a very, duffy, dry, decomposed pine needle, sandy soil. So we'll see, but those two have done the best for me. And what is it? It's the native, it's a native shrub that I just put in. That's also supposed to do well in the dry shade. I can't remember the name of it right now, but if you go to Prairie Moon and do the search for dry shady plants, you'll come up with some ideas.
Yeah. Another good source is Prairie Nursery for shrubs.
Yes.
And things. Yeah, they both do.
Yep.
Yeah, I've found that the less aggressive goldenrods, like the blue stemmed and the zigzag, will do pretty well.
Okay.
In dry shade. Are you finding native plants already there under the oaks and pines that surround your place?
Yeah, so this hillside project I was talking about was soil that was brought in by the builder to create this berm. The rest of the property, it's been interesting. There's a section of the property that's basically between the pine plantation on top of the hill and the lake at the bottom of the hill. And it was pretty, I think it was, it wasn't farmed. And so it's been pretty undisturbed, but it was overtaken by brambles. So I went into that section and for 3 years in a row, I cut back the brambles. I used my little tiny, my spray bottle of Roundup and just sprayed the cut ends of the brambles and did that year after year. And it's been pretty neat. Once I got those out, I've had some wild blueberries pop up, some gooseberries, some hazelnuts.
Wow, nice.
And then, of course, we do have some really interesting native shrubs other than there. We have a lot of elderberry, maple leaf, viburnum, hawthorn, which is just done flowering right now. I hadn't talked about the trees and shrubs. We've planted a lot of those, but there are a lot on our property as well. So it's been really fun to pull away this bramble cover and see what's been hiding underneath.
Well, we've got one last question here, it looks like, and it's rather a general question.
Sure.
How can I tell what kind of soil I have?
Well, when you read any kind of advice on planting native plants, they say, bring a soil sample in and have it tested for, pH and nutrition level and all that. I tend to be a little bit more casual. I just pick the soil up and hold it in my hand and squeeze it and see what happens. And if it stays together in a ball, it's more clay. If it falls apart, it's more sand. And our property is kind of interesting because up by the road, it's sandy on top, but then we have this clay hard pan that's about 20, 24 inches down. So I'm not even sure how to classify it because the water runs through, but then it catches at the bottom. So I think the best way to figure out what kind of soil you have is to go out with a shovel, dig around and see what happens, see how friable it is, see how the water penetrates through, watch after a heavy rain and see, is it dry in an hour? Is it dry, the next day? Is it still holding water? So just keep an eye on, your piece of land and see what water does when it hits the soil.
Mhm. Wonderful, thank you. Well, I think we have reached the end of the questions in our chat. So I guess I'd like to say thank you so much. I really enjoyed your talk, Shelley, and you should give it again.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
All right,
It
good
is
night.
fun. Okay.